In 1985, the Saudi ambassador to Washington was a man named Prince Bandar bin Sultan, and he did something that the Reagan administration did not know was happening and would not have approved of if it had known. He traveled to Beijing in secret, without the knowledge of the American government, to open negotiations on the purchase of Chinese medium-range ballistic missiles, the East Wind CSS-2, weapons capable of carrying nuclear warheads and reaching targets across the entire Middle East. Saudi Arabia and China did not even have formal diplomatic relations at the time. The missiles were eventually acquired, and they were smuggled into Saudi Arabia without Washington knowing, and when American intelligence finally discovered what had happened, there was a significant crisis in the relationship between the two governments. The Reagan administration was furious. It felt betrayed. It had spent decades building a security relationship with the kingdom, selling it weapons, stationing its soldiers in the Gulf, protecting Saudi oil infrastructure with the implicit and sometimes explicit guarantee of American military power. The Saudis had gone to Beijing behind its back to buy weapons that America would never have sold them. Prince Bandar's response to Washington's anger was essentially to shrug. Saudi Arabia, he made clear, had its own interests. Those interests sometimes aligned with American interests and sometimes did not, and when they did not, Saudi Arabia would pursue them with whatever partner was most useful, regardless of what Washington thought about it. 40 years later, in the spring of 2026, Mohammed bin Salman is making decisions that Prince Bandar would recognize immediately, and Washington is discovering, again, that the relationship it believed it had with the kingdom is not quite the relationship that the kingdom believes it has with Washington. The context in which MBS is making these decisions is unlike anything that has existed in the Gulf since the American security umbrella was first extended over the region in the decades following the Second World War. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran that assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, struck Iranian military and nuclear facilities across the country, and triggered an Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz that has now lasted nearly 3 months, and that has reduced traffic through the world's most important energy choke point to approximately 5% of its pre-conflict level. Saudi Arabia has been watching this unfold from a position that combines acute economic interest, genuine strategic uncertainty, and the particular caution of a government that learned a painful lesson from its intervention in Yemen, where MBS committed to what he expected to be a quick, decisive military campaign, and found himself 9 years later still trying to extract Saudi Arabia from a conflict that had consumed lives and resources and international reputation without achieving its stated objectives. The Sultan Center, assessing Saudi Arabia's position in the second week of May 2026, described MBS as having reverted to form, favoring caution, patience, and long-term positioning over short-term gains, which is a diplomatic way of saying that the crown prince who launched the Yemen war impulsively has been replaced by a more calculating version of the same man, one who is watching the Iran war unfold and making very deliberate choices about where Saudi Arabia's interests lie and how best to protect them. Those choices have not gone in the direction that Washington expected or wanted. Saudi Arabia has not joined the American-Israeli military coalition against Iran. It has not allowed its territory to be used as a staging ground for American strikes in ways that would make it a co-belligerent. Its ambassador to Washington, Dr. Riyad Krimli, posted publicly on the social platform X that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia continues to stand in support of de-escalation and avoiding escalation, as well as negotiations and the efforts undertaken regarding them. The gap between that statement and the kind of full-throated support that America's closest allies expressed in a crisis tells you something precise about where Saudi Arabia has decided to position itself. Not against Washington, not aligned with Tehran, somewhere in the middle, maintaining what the Wilson Center has described as a studied neutrality in the emerging competition between the United States and China, a neutrality that has a specific economic logic behind it, and that is reshaping the security architecture of the Gulf in ways that neither Washington nor Beijing has fully processed. The economic logic is not complicated, but it is frequently obscured by the language of alliances and partnerships and strategic commitments, so it is worth stating plainly. Saudi Arabia's economy depends on oil revenues. Those oil revenues depend on Saudi Arabia being able to export its oil to buyers. The single largest buyer of Saudi oil is not the United States, which has become a net oil exporter and no longer depends on Gulf crude the way it once did. The single largest buyer of Saudi oil is China, which imports approximately 2 million barrels per day of Saudi crude, and which is the most important customer for the expansion of Saudi production capacity and the development of the petrochemical and downstream sectors that are central to MBS's Vision 2030 economic transformation plan. China's importance to Saudi Arabia's economic future is therefore not a matter of geopolitical preference, but of mathematical reality. And the decisions MBS makes about security partnerships and arms acquisitions and diplomatic alignments are being made in full awareness of this mathematical reality, in a way that Washington's analyses of Saudi behavior sometimes fail to adequately account for. The arms relationship between Saudi Arabia and China has been growing steadily for a decade, and the Iran war has accelerated it in ways that are directly relevant to the question of what is replacing the American security umbrella in the Gulf. Between 2016 and 2020, China increased its arms transfers to Saudi Arabia by nearly 400% compared to the previous 5-year period. In 2017, Saudi Arabia acquired several Chinese Wing Lung 2 armed drones and entered into a memorandum of understanding with China to manufacture an additional 300 drones domestically, which is not just an arms purchase, but a technology transfer that builds Saudi Arabia's independent military manufacturing capacity using Chinese designs. In 2022, Riyadh signed roughly $4 billion in new arms deals with Chinese firms, including an agreement to jointly design and manufacture drones. In 2024, China sent more than 30 defense companies under the China Defense banner to the Saudi World Defense Show in Riyadh and displayed the J-10 fighter jet's Bayi aerobatic team in the first overseas exhibition for that group. Since 2019, Saudi military forces have engaged in maritime exercises with Chinese counterparts, and the Chinese Naval Escort Task Force has conducted port calls in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Defense Minister, Prince Khalid bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, paid an official visit to China in June 2024 to meet his Chinese counterpart, Admiral Dong Jun, and discuss ways to deepen the military partnership between the two states. These are not the transactions of a country that views China as a secondary option to be kept in reserve in case the American relationship sours. They are the transactions of a country that has been systematically building a parallel security relationship with Beijing over many years, quietly and without dramatic announcements, in exactly the tradition of Prince Bandar traveling to Beijing in 1985. The event that accelerated this trajectory in ways that the Middle East Institute's Singapore chapter described as having shaken Gulf confidence in U.S. protection was the Israeli airstrike on Hamas leadership in Qatar in August 2025. Qatar is not Saudi Arabia, but it is a Gulf state, and it hosts the American military headquarters for the entire Central Command region. And the fact that Israel was willing and able to conduct an airstrike on the soil of a country that hosts 10,000 American troops, and the forward headquarters of American military power in the Middle East, sent a message to every Gulf ruler that the American umbrella had terms and conditions that Washington had not fully disclosed. The Saudi-Pakistan Strategic Military and Defense Agreement, which was signed in the aftermath of that event, was described by the Middle East Institute as a meeting point of vulnerabilities, with Riyadh searching for alternatives and Islamabad seeking guarantees, and both aligning their interests in ways long anticipated but never before formalized. The SMDA is a defense agreement that has China's fingerprints on it without China being a formal signatory, because Pakistan's military relationships run through Beijing in ways that mean a security agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan is also, in a structural sense, a security agreement between Saudi Arabia and the Chinese security ecosystem that Pakistan inhabits. The Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement that Saudi Arabia signed with China in December 2022 during Xi Jinping's visit to Riyadh was described by Beijing as an epoch-making milestone in the history of China-Arab relations. That language is diplomatic hyperbole of a fairly standard kind, but the substance behind it was real. The agreement committed both countries to deepening cooperation across economic, political, and security dimensions. It was signed at a moment when the relationship between MBS and the Biden administration was at one of its lowest points, after Biden's earlier campaign promise to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi had poisoned the atmosphere between the two governments. Xi Jinping arrived in Riyadh when Biden would not, and the symbolism of that moment was not lost on MBS or on anyone watching from Washington. The Iran war has now created a specific and urgent dimension to this long-running strategic reorientation. Iran has declared that the Strait of Hormuz is closed to unfriendly nations and has allowed only Iran-approved vessels to pass, mostly petroleum ships bound for China and India, some with military escort from Iranian naval vessels. That phrase, most notably petroleum ships bound for China, some with military escort, describes a situation that has no precedent in the history of the Strait, and that contains within it a geopolitical reality that Washington has not publicly acknowledged. Iran is allowing Chinese-bound petroleum to move through the strait that it has declared closed to American and Allied shipping. The IRGC has been providing military escort to ships carrying crude oil to China through the same waterway, where it has attacked and seized vessels bound for other destinations. China has vetoed, together with Russia, a United Nations Security Council resolution drafted by Bahrain that called for an end to Iranian attacks on commercial shipping and for coordinated defensive escort operations. Beijing called freedom of navigation in the Strait a shared call of the international community, while simultaneously accepting military escort from the Iranian Navy for ships carrying its oil, a position that is logically inconsistent, but strategically coherent, because China wants the oil and does not want the resolution that would require it to choose a side in the conflict. Saudi Arabia has been watching this dynamic with a particular attention because it illustrates the fundamental shift in leverage that has occurred in the Gulf since the war began. The Yanbu pipeline, which runs from Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu on the western coast, was the subject of an analysis published by Engineering News Record in mid-March 2026 that described Saudi Arabia as the only state capable of partially replacing Hormuz-dependent supply, noting that the pipeline could help to partially offset the nearly 20 million barrels per day that typically transit through the strait. Saudi Arabia's ability to route oil exports through the Red Sea rather than the Persian Gulf gives it a form of leverage in the current crisis that no other producer in the region possesses, and MBS has been using that leverage with a deliberateness and calculation that the Chatham House assessment of May 2026 described as caution, patience, and long-term positioning. By mid-March 2026, Saudi exports through the Red Sea averaged between 2 and 2. 5 million barrels per day, with Saudi Aramco working to maximize pipeline capacity, and the House of Saud analysis from March 2026 stated that Saudi Arabia is the only state capable of partially replacing Hormuz-dependent supply, and that the Yanbu pipeline could help to partially offset the supply disruption. This capacity is the source of MBS's indispensability in the current crisis, and it is the card he is playing with both Washington and Beijing simultaneously, making himself useful to both sides without fully committing to either. Ukraine's role in this picture is one of the more unexpected dimensions of the Middle East crisis of 2026. Zelensky arrived in Saudi Arabia in late March for an unannounced visit, and Saudi Arabia and Ukraine were reported to be in the final stages of signing a security cooperation agreement specifically focused on the protection of airspace, a particularly relevant capability given that Iran had demonstrated throughout the war an extensive capacity to strike Gulf infrastructure with drones and missiles, and that Saudi Arabia had been hit by Iranian ballistic missiles and drone attacks in the opening weeks of the conflict. The interest among Gulf countries in Ukrainian arms technology, particularly Ukraine's drone warfare expertise and its air defense innovations developed under 4 years of Russian bombardment, was described by the Middle East Institute's Singapore chapter as having been significantly spurred by the Iran war. Ukraine has spent 4 years learning to survive aerial bombardment more effectively than any other country in the world, and the Gulf states that are now facing the same threat from Iranian missiles and drones are willing to pay for that knowledge. Saudi Arabia acquiring Ukrainian air defense technology in the middle of a war where Iran is attacking Gulf infrastructure is the kind of transaction that reshapes regional military balances in ways that take years to fully register. The broader pattern that all of these transactions add up to is one that the Washington Institute for Near East Policy described in its November 2025 assessment of the U.S.-Saudi relationship as a sophisticated bilateral relationship in an era of competition with China, one where the administration should use Saudi Arabia's dependence on American technology and the Crown Prince's visit to the White House to constrain Saudi military engagement with Beijing. The Trump administration had done some version of this, signing a series of defense, semiconductor, nuclear power, and other agreements with MBS during his White House visit, agreements that Atlantic Council experts described as significant in their scope. Trump told reporters that he and MBS had always been on the same side of every issue, a characterization that the Saudi ambassador's subsequent statement about de-escalation and the Saudi defense minister's trips to Beijing and the Saudi-Pakistan military agreement and the Saudi-Ukraine arms technology talks all simultaneously complicated. You can be on the same side of every issue with Trump and still be building parallel security relationships with China, acquiring Chinese drones, signing defense agreements with Pakistani intermediaries connected to the Chinese security ecosystem, and maintaining studied neutrality in the conflict that Trump launched. MBS has demonstrated that these things are not contradictions. They are a strategy. The Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft warned in its analysis of the Saudi-Pakistan defense agreement that such a pact would fundamentally alter the U.S. security posture in the Gulf and constrain future administrations' freedom of action. The Gulf International Forum's assessment of the Saudi-China military partnership was more measured, concluding that despite a bilateral willingness to deepen defense engagement, Saudi Arabia is keenly aware that China is not capable of fully replacing the United States as Saudi Arabia's primary security guarantor. That assessment is correct in the narrow military sense that China does not have the naval assets, the forward basing infrastructure, the power projection capability, or the demonstrated willingness to use military force in the Gulf that America possesses. China has no bases in Saudi Arabia. The United States has $126 billion in active government-to-government military sales cases with the kingdom. These are not symmetrical relationships. But the question of whether China is replacing the United States as Saudi Arabia's security guarantor is not the right question. The right question is whether MBS is using China as leverage to reshape the terms of his relationship with the United States, to extract technology transfers and nuclear energy agreements and civilian nuclear enrichment rights and defense commitments that Washington has historically been reluctant to provide, by making credibly visible the alternative of deepening the Beijing relationship if Washington does not deliver. That is Prince Bandar's strategy from 1985, updated for 2026, and it is working in the specific sense that Trump signed agreements with MBS in Washington and described him as someone he had always been on the same side with, while MBS's defense minister was visiting Beijing and MBS was maintaining neutrality in America's war against Iran. The second demand that Saudi Arabia has placed at the center of its negotiations with Washington is civilian nuclear technology with enrichment rights, which is the most sensitive element of the entire Saudi-American relationship, because enrichment rights are the technical capability that stands between a civilian nuclear program and a nuclear weapons program. Saudi Arabia has been explicit that its nuclear ambitions will not be constrained in ways that do not apply to Israel, which is widely understood to possess nuclear weapons, and has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. MBS told an American interviewer in 2023 that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will seek one too, a statement of strategic intent that Washington has been trying to manage through the offer of civilian nuclear cooperation that does not include enrichment rights. Saudi Arabia has rejected that offer as insufficient. The Quincy Institute and the INSS have both analyzed the implications of a formal U.S.-Saudi defense pact that includes civilian nuclear technology, with the Quincy Institute warning that such a pact would constrain future administrations' freedom of action in ways that go well beyond the immediate relationship with MBS. In the current context, where Iran's nuclear program has been significantly damaged by American and Israeli strikes but not permanently eliminated, and where the post-Khamenei Iranian power structure has not committed to any verifiable agreement not to rebuild enrichment capacity, the Saudi demand for enrichment rights has an urgency and a logic that Washington finds difficult to dismiss. What MBS has understood, and what the architecture of Saudi behavior since February 28th confirms, is that the Iran war has made Saudi Arabia more indispensable to American strategic interests than it has been at any point since the 1970s oil crisis, and that this indispensability is a wasting asset that will diminish as the war ends and Hormuz reopens and oil prices fall back toward their pre-conflict levels. The time to extract maximum concessions from Washington is now, while Saudi Arabia controls the Yanbu pipeline alternative, and while the global economy is suffering from the Hormuz closure, and while Trump needs Gulf cooperation to present the Iran war as a strategic success rather than an economic catastrophe. The call to Beijing is part of the same calculation. It is the visible reminder to Washington that there is an alternative, that China is willing to deepen the military relationship, that the Saudi-Pakistan agreement creates Chinese-adjacent security arrangements that could expand, that Beijing has already demonstrated in March 2023 that it can play mediator in Gulf disputes in ways that Washington assumed were its exclusive domain. MBS is not replacing the U.S. Navy with China's Navy. He is using the possibility of that replacement, kept carefully visible and carefully incomplete, to change what the United States is willing to give him in exchange for not doing it. Prince Bandar traveled to Beijing in 1985 in secret and came back with missiles and a crisis in the U.S.-Saudi relationship that eventually resolved itself without fundamentally altering the security arrangement between the two countries. Mohammed bin Salman is traveling a version of the same road in 2026, but he is doing it more openly, with more leverage, in a more complicated regional environment, and at a moment when the American security umbrella that has covered the Gulf since the 1940s is visibly straining under the weight of a war whose economic consequences are being felt in every country on Earth that runs on oil. The American Navy is still in the Gulf. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is still in the Arabian Sea. The United States is still the primary military power in the region by every measurable metric. But MBS has made it unmistakably clear that this reality is a starting point for negotiation, rather than a settled fact that constrains his choices, and the hidden call to Beijing is the instrument through which he keeps that negotiation permanently open. The India dimension of this story has received less attention than it deserves, and it illuminates the degree to which the Iran war has scrambled the security assumptions of every government in the region, rather than just the Gulf states. India launched Operation Urja Suraksha on March 23, 2026, a maritime security operation designed to protect the nation's energy supplies by escorting Indian-flagged ships and ships destined for Indian ports through the Arabian Sea. India imports approximately 44% of its oil from the Gulf region, and the Hormuz closure has imposed severe economic pressure on an economy that is significantly more dependent on Gulf energy than China, which has been able to arrange Iranian military escorts for its supply ships through the same strait that is closed to others. Pakistan, which has been acting as the American back-channel mediator with Iran throughout the conflict, has used this mediating role to sideline India's efforts to establish itself as a credible global diplomatic actor. As the Middle East Institute's assessment noted, a development that galls New Delhi and that further complicates the regional security picture by introducing a new dimension of India-Pakistan competition into a crisis that is already complicated enough. India's Operation Urja Suraksha is not a NATO operation or a US-led multilateral effort. It is a unilateral Indian decision to protect its own energy supplies, because no existing multilateral security arrangement has proven capable of doing it, which is itself a comment on the state of the American-led security order in the Gulf in the spring of 2026. Turkey's position in all of this is the final piece of the puzzle that makes the picture fully visible. Turkey is a NATO member. It controls the Bosphorus under the Montreux Convention. It has been buying Russian oil at discounted prices throughout the Ukraine war. It has been deepening its economic and strategic relationship with China through its involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative. And in the context of the Iran war, Turkey has been maintaining the same studied neutrality that characterizes Saudi Arabia's position, neither joining the American coalition, nor aligning openly with Iran, using its geographic position and its Montreux authority and its relationships with multiple sides to position itself as a potential mediator and to extract maximum economic and political benefit from a conflict that it did not start, and that it is carefully managing not to be drawn into. Turkey's posture is the regional template for how middle powers navigate a moment when the American security order is under strain, and the Chinese alternative is not yet capable of fully replacing it. And MBS has been watching Ankara's approach with the appreciation of a strategist who recognizes a playbook he is running himself. What all of these threads add up to is a regional security environment that looks from Washington like a series of individual decisions by individual governments, each with its own explanation and context, and that looks from Riyadh and Ankara and Beijing and New Delhi like a systemic shift in the architecture of Gulf security that has been building for a decade, and that the Iran war has accelerated into visibility. The U.S. Navy is still the most powerful military force in the region. The American security guarantee is still the most credible deterrent available to Gulf states against the most severe threats they face. But the assumption that these facts automatically translate into Gulf deference to American preferences, into automatic alignment with American policy choices, into the kind of reliable partnership that Washington believes it has built and maintained since the 1940s, is the assumption that Prince Bandar disproved in 1985 and that MBS is disproving again in 2026. The hidden call to Beijing is not a declaration of independence from Washington. It is a reminder that independence is always available, always being considered, and always one concession away from not being exercised. That is the oldest game in Gulf diplomacy, and Mohammed bin Salman is playing it with the patience and precision of someone who has learned from 4 decades of watching his predecessors play it before him. The specific military transactions that are reshaping the Gulf in 2026 need to be held in mind alongside the strategic analysis, because they give the abstractions of geopolitics a concrete and measurable form. Saudi Arabia has purchased Chinese ballistic missiles capable of reaching targets across the region. It has signed agreements to manufacture 300 Chinese-designed drones domestically, building an independent drone production capacity inside Saudi Arabia using Chinese technology. It has sent its defense minister to Beijing to discuss deepening the military partnership at a moment when American analysts are urging Washington to use the Crown Prince's dependence on American semiconductor technology as leverage to constrain exactly that kind of deepening. It has signed a defense agreement with Pakistan that the Middle East Institute and the Quincy Institute both identify as creating Chinese-adjacent security structures that could expand in scope and formality over time. It has opened negotiations with Ukraine on air defense technology cooperation, bringing into the Saudi security ecosystem the expertise of the country that has spent 4 years developing the most advanced practical knowledge of surviving aerial bombardment that exists anywhere in the world. And it has maintained throughout all of this a public posture of studied neutrality that allows it to deny that any of these transactions amount to a fundamental reorientation, to insist that it remains a partner of the United States, to sign agreements in Washington with Trump, who declares they have always been on the same side, while building in parallel every element of a security architecture that does not depend on American willingness and American reliability in the way that the previous architecture did. The hidden call to Beijing is not one call, it is 40 years of calls, each one individually deniable, collectively undeniable, patiently building toward a Gulf security order in which no single power holds the keys, and Saudi Arabia holds more of them than anyone else. MBS did not replace the U.S. Navy with one phone call. He has been replacing it one transaction at a time for years, and the Iran war has finally made visible what was always happening underneath the surface of the alliance.